Okay, so we were talking about Impressionism on Monday. This new movement trying to capture something quite modern with a modern style, on the one hand, that breaks all of the rules of that had been taught by the French Royal Academy, right? Remember, well, all the way back to the beginning, the Royal Academy had been set up sort of to teach classicism, right? That was how it was originally established, and that sort of traditional academic approach to art where you study everything thoroughly before you begin working, right? And sometimes are reference heavy to art of the past, certainly very respectful of art of the past. And the Impressionists are sort of turning that on its ear by working very directly, very immediately, almost sketchy in their approach. They tend not to polish the brushstrokes, to blend them together on the canvas. They leave it looking as if it were spontaneously made. And we talked on Monday about how really that's kind of a artifice. That's a creation on the part of the artist. That many of these did take quite a long time to paint, but they make it look as if it were easy, right? They make it look as if it were quick, and make it look like it's an impression, right? And so this group is working together, right, for 12 years, more or less. But again, it's a fluctuating group, right? They're not like hanging out together all the time. Some of them are, right? Manet and Monet. Right? Manet's got the cash, Monet's broke, right? They're going out and drinking together, and that's not extraordinary. But they're, the group itself over the course of these 1874 to 1886, right? Those 12 years that the group shows together. It's not just one group of people. There's people coming in and going out all the time, right? So I think the one that showed the most of all of them was Pissarro, and he was in all but one, I think, right? Monet was only in 5, okay? So it's a new way of painting, right? Brighter palette, right? A brighter color range, general avoidance of blacks, although that's not always the case, but in these we see it. A dedication to painting outside and using the bright colors to capture these moments of light and shadow, these changing effects of color, right? Really is as much a focus for them as the subject matter they choose to depict. But the subject matter still remained very, very important to them, right? The road bridge in Argenteuil is for Monet a very important theme. We talked about the importance of rebuilding France after the Commune and the Franco-Prussian War. For Pissarro, he believes that rural farm life is a moral antidote to life in the city, right? That it has a sort of a stronger sense of character and ethics than city life does. So the subject matter is still very important, but within that, there's also this attempt to focus on how light looks at a particular moment, right? Which is what gives them their name. Well, Georges Seurat, exhibited this work in the very, very last Impressionist show in 1886. So he's part of the group, right? At the same time, this is I think, only his second work that was in an Impressionist show. He comes in very late. He's of a younger generation. And he shares certain things with the Impressionists, a sort of dedication to bright colors, attempting to evoke a certain quality of light outside. Right? In this case, it's a park in Paris, or in the outskirts of Paris. Le Grand Jatte is an island in the Seine River. If you know Paris, the Seine sort of snakes its way through Paris before it goes out toward the ocean. And as it's on its way out of Paris, sort of downstream from the city, right, and moving its way out of Paris, there's this island that was a huge park in the 19th century, and everybody went there, right? It was this, like Central Park in New York, right? We don't really have something similar, but I guess the mall, but it doesn't have the same sense, even our park, as green as DC is, we don't use our parks as much of a refuge as they would, right? And it became this melting pot for all parts of society, and that's what Seurat is depicting, is this grand sort of collage of professions, of class differentials, right? We've got the You got a working class guy with a bowler cap and a pipe, right? In what my wife and I affectionately call the wife beater, right? The tank top in the lower left corner. And he's got this mongrel sort of lab-like dog, and he's sitting immediately next to this woman in a petticoat, and that swanky hat, the fellow with a cane, right? This is what parks do in urban environments. They bring everybody together regardless of class difference, right? A woman over here fishing, a little girl, right, with her mom in a parasol. This really elegant couple coming in from the right, and get this, they got a pet monkey, right? As well, very sort of artificial, and everybody's coming together. We got trumpet players, we got soldiers. Everybody's in profile or facing us. It's not a lot of movement, even though there's a little girl running. There's something frozen about it all, which is part of Seurat's charm. Now, he's part of the group, right? He exhibits with the Impressionists, but he's moving in a new direction. And there's a lot of artists in the 1880s, particularly the late 1880s, that begin to take sort of the ideas that the Impressionists had and begin to sort of say, okay, I'm going to move off away from them. I'm going to take those ideas, I'm going to run with them in a new direction, right? I'm going to take that pass, I'm going to take that handoff, and I'm going over here, right? In a tangent. And they would have still considered themselves to be sort of Impressionists. I don't know if they probably would have called themselves modern artists, right? But in the 1920s, we look back and we say, wow, this is really different from the Impressionists. We want to give them a new term, right? And I think it comes up on a later slide, but we tend now to refer to them as post-Impressionists because a lot of them, Seurat included, are active after the Impressionists are done, right? That 12-year run. And they're taking Impressionist ideas and doing things the Impressionists didn't do. Right? They don't adhere to some of the central core ideas. They might adhere to some of them, but others they do not. Right? It's called post-Impressionism, or originally they called it neo-Impressionism, but we now say sort of post-Impressionism. Right? So that'll come up on a later slide. So Seurat exhibits with the Impressionists, but he's doing something different. He's not working outside. That's one. He's working primarily in the studio. Okay. Now he will do studies for these pictures outside. Right? He'll go out with little tiny. We have about 12 of these in the National Gallery, and they're all about like this big, like postcard size. And he'll go out with those and do studies, right? So here he's on the Grand Jatte, right? And some of the figures there, and he's putting down colors and sort of mapping them in a sort of Impressionist way. A little bit more methodical than the Impressionists in that he's really interested in sort of unifying the size of the brushstroke so that everywhere you look, it's almost exactly the same. It's like looking way too close at an old TV set where you see all the red and blue and green dots, or an old magazine that had the dot pattern, the way they used to print back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, And the same thing is here. There's something sort of rigorous about the way in which he puts the paint down so that everywhere you look, the paint strokes are basically the same size, right? Another one of the women in the shadow, right? And you can see that he's also playing with the colors next to each other being opposites from each other. They're almost like they sort of shimmer. Oranges next to blues, reds next to greens, right? And these kinds of color combinations tend to really dance. And Seurat is very much aware of that shimmering quality that these have. And then he goes back into the studio with these different studies that he's been doing outside, right? He's taking a bunch of little pieces of wood, right, outside. These are all on wood about that size. He comes outside, has pockets full of them. He takes them out to the Grand Jatte, goes back to the studio to paint this work, and he spends about 2 years on it. Right? That's why it's got such a long date range. It's not like he's picked it up and stopped. He worked on it almost exclusively for the better part of 2 years, right? And part of the reason for that is that it's so big, right? It certainly is something you can't. Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right? They spend time in the Chicago Art Institute. They go see this. There's his friend. I forget his name. Cameron. Cameron was his name. It's a little bit even after my time. My wife loves it, though, right? Anyway, there he is looking at it. It gives you a sense of scale. That's part of the reason it took him so long, right? Is A, it's huge, and B, that's also indicating that he ain't doing this outside. And the other thing that we see when we look up close, and this is something that's really alternative to the Impressionists, is again his brushwork. He's still using that idea of these minuscule brushstrokes. Now, it's inspired by the Impressionists, right? We saw Monet not blending his brushstrokes, and neither does Seurat, but Monet had a little bit more expression in them, variation within them, right? A wave would look like a wave. The side of the boat would look kind of like the side of the boat, but here, everything is this little slashes and dots everywhere we look. And that as we move here, we're on the sort of the edge. I think we're sort of just below the butterfly. Right? And thank you, Google, right? There's this Google Art project that has monster scans of a lot of images. That's what these came from, right? Sometimes it'll bog my computer down, they're so big. But if you look at the darkness of the grass, the shadow, you'll notice that it's not just green. Even though from a distance, if you look behind the shoulders of that seated woman, it looks like forest green. But then we get into it, we see that it's blues and oranges, right? 2 or 3 shades of blue, as well as the green, and that the color is being blended by your eye, rather than being blended by the artist on the palette, right? That optical marriage of colors. Right? Now, Seurat, in doing this, is not only influenced by Monet and the Impressionists, and the way in which they left their colors unblended, but he's also being influenced by scientific approaches to color theory. Right? This is during the same time that physicists realized that light travels in particles, right? That light waves, right, that produce colors are also have a particle nature, right? I'm not a physicist, but I took this stuff once when I was your age, right? That's about how much I remember it. But if light is particles, then you can see what Seurat's doing, right? It's particles on the canvas. But also, they're talking about the fact that light blends in your eye. Like they're psychologists, they're talking about how we perceive color, right? And that our eye will blend colors if they're placed next to each other. So, green, for example, is a mixture. If you're an artist, you mix yellow with blue, and you get green, right? And back in the day, if it was somebody like Constable, right, or Van Ruysdael painting a green grass, what they would have done is they would have taken the yellow and the blue on their palette, they would have mixed it up, and they would have painted green. But what Seurat does is he paints blue next to yellow, and your eye makes it green by seeing them side by side. Your eye blends the colors, optical blending. And this is something that's being written about at this time, and Seurat is also experimenting with that. So it's a really kind of scientific approach to painting. The other thing that happened is that they developed the color wheel. If you've ever taken art classes, the color wheel is something you just learn, right? As if it was like always there, ever since God created the earth. But it's not. It wasn't. The idea of putting the range of colors that one might see in the spectrum onto a wheel is indeed a relatively new phenomenon, 1880 or so, right? And he's picking up on it as well. And one of the things that color theory tells us is that, colors next to each other when they blend become the color between, but colors that are opposite to each other on the wheel, right, will in fact vibrate against each other. Think of like blacklight posters from the late 60s, for the Grateful Dead or something like that. And you get that same sort of optical illusions. And for Seurat, he's using that idea, yellows next to purples, greens next to reds, orange next to blue, in order to make the surface of the picture that much more vibrant. Right? So he's very much influenced by color theory, contemporary color theory. Here's the wife of our tank top fellow. And you can see as we look at his tank top that from a distance, that sort of burgundy colored, orangish colored tank top is filled with dots of paint that are opposites on the color wheel. Right? Oranges next to blues is one of his favorites, but we also get reds and greens next to each other, right? And all of that gives it a sort of an optical quality, right? Now, when he wrote about this, he called the technique divisionism, right? He's dividing the colors to its constituent elements. The term that you hear more often anymore is pointillism, painting with points of color, right? And the entire work is made up with this incredibly meticulous, almost like it's a carpet of dots of color, right? That your eye optically blends. And like I said, around the 1920s, we began to, art historians, I wasn't around in the 1920s, they began, I mean, I'm not that old yet, right? But they began to look at these things and say, okay, he may have exhibited with the Impressionists, but this is really not Impressionist in outlook. This is not really in keeping with the ideas they had. This methodical moving away from what they're doing into something, this is investigation of color theory for its own sake almost, is doing something different. And there's a bunch of artists, we're going to look at 4 of them, moving in different directions in the 80s and the 1890s, right? And we use this umbrella term, post-impressionism, even though each one is doing something kind of different, right? But they're all taking ideas of impressionism and going their own directions. Okay? So the first of these is Seurat, right? The second one of them is Paul Cézanne, who, for my money, when we get into him, I think he's one of the most amazing painters that really ever lived. And he was part of the original group. He was one of the original 30 artists that got together with Monet in 1873, right? So he's part of that first group that's called the Impressionists. And he exhibits with them for the first 2 or 3 Impressionist exhibitions. And then he decides he's had enough. He's had enough of the Parisian art world. He's had enough of all of this. And he ends up moving back to the town he grew up in the south of France, in Provence. And it's a town of Aix-en-Provence, which I went to there for the first time last summer before last. And this is where he grew up, where his father was there. He eventually inherits his father's money. Works more or less in isolation from about 1878 onward in Aix-en-Provence, but sends his works back to be sold and exhibited in Paris, right? And the image that we see here, Mont Sainte-Victoire, is this rocky outcrop, about 3,000 feet high, just outside of Provence, right? Provence kind of sits on the side of a hill. You go up the hill outside of Provence, you have this beautiful view, this extraordinary rocky mountain. And Cézanne paints it about 30 different times. He loves to repeat the same subject matter in the same way that Monet had, right? Remember, Impressionists would repeat subjects because they wanted to find the variation within the quality of light each time they did it. Well, when we look at Cézanne, when he repeats subject matter, he's doing it really to investigate the composition, the overall composition. He's using for Cézanne, right? I don't want to use my notes because I think it's better. Cézanne, as an artist, is really fascinated with how every part of the composition should have an active role to play in the composition. There should be no dead areas. Okay? And so when we make art, we often talk about the idea that you have positive space and negative space. So if you've got a mind's eye, just think Las Meninas, okay, the Velázquez picture of little girls, right, and the positive space are the figures, right? The negative space is the stuff around it. The areas that don't do much, right? The background versus the foreground, okay? And the subject matter is the thing, and the negative space is the stuff around it, right? So if I'm going to draw Jason right now, I'd draw him, and then anything else would just be the negative space. Cézanne doesn't believe there's any negative space. Cézanne believes that the negative space is every bit as important as the positive space. Right? And what happens when we look at Cézanne is that we find that he's really interested in sort of breaking down the different parts of the composition, right, to analyze each one and then kind of put it back together way that maybe isn't exactly the way it looked when he saw it. So here, how do we see it? Let's become clear as we look at like four Cezanne pictures, right? So he's looking out over this landscape, and you see the little dotted with these little like Monopoly houses, right? Look how like board game, little plastic houses you buy to put on the boardwalk. And at the same time, he's using almost the exact same color scheme everywhere, these yellows and these greens. And you start to see that he starts to break up the space into these little areas, right? That just sort of work their way back into space. And down in the lower left corner by the tree trunk there, you can see that at a certain point there's no sort of attempt to make that adhere to some sort of object that you might see. It's really kind of breaking it down, right? And what he's most interested in is sort of charging that space and charging these different areas and using the brush strokes to sort of turn it into almost like a jigsaw puzzle of pieces that every one of them has got something to do, right? And that's especially true when we look up in the sky, where the branches of that fir tree, probably more like pine tree, coming out, the areas between the branches become almost as important as the branches do. And if you look just between the two major branches, sort of top center, you can see that he's come back and he's sort of painted that area in between them as well, and given it almost as much solidity as the branches themselves. And that's really a Cezanne trick, that and the idea of excuse me, of making sure that every part of the composition's got some structure, a role to play in the overall composition. I've got some details, so I'll bring this over here instead. We're not really, the whole point of having the Wi-Fi is to be able to do this, right? So what he ends up doing is taking it and seeing it as if it were a series of structures that sort of fit together. And his job as an artist, and I think this is the important thing, right? Really important thing for this idea of what we've been talking about with art moving into something less traditional. And I also think it's an important thing for understanding art in general. What's the artist's job? What is the artist's role? What is art supposed to do? What is the artist supposed to do? Is the artist supposed to, is there some rule that says the artist's job is to replicate nature exactly? Or is the artist's job, and this is what Cezanne would argue, to make a terrific composition, if we talk about a painting, within the four corners of this flat surface, right? Now, some might argue that the art they like the best does a little bit of both, right? Makes a wonderful composition where all the parts work and make that composition perfect, and still resembles the visible world in some way. But is there some rule that says it has to be faithful to what was in front of you when you started? The answer is obviously no. And that becomes more obvious to artists as photography becomes more widespread. Because a photograph can do that. If that's what you want, then here's a machine, right? Does that for you. A painter's job is to make a composition that shows how they have taken what they've seen and they've interpreted it. They've done something with it, right? And it goes back to this sort of bigger question about the role of art. Is art just there to... I think the role of art is to make us see the world in a different way than we would have seen it without it. To make us appreciate something, to call attention to this, that, or the other thing. And sometimes that can have a social role, a social agenda, like the Stonebreakers or the Gleaners in the realist mood, right? They can want us to see something in a different way because we're not paying enough attention to it. Okay, that's great. Other times it's like, hey, look at this, and look at it new and look at it different. And I think with Cezanne, that's really obvious. Because I don't know of another landscape painter whose paintings I don't go out and see the world differently. He said, one of his most famous quotes is that one should try to understand nature or see nature through the cone and the cylinder and the square or the cube, right? In other words, all of nature is made up with these sort of simplified geometric shapes that you could restructure. Everything is a cone or a cylinder or a cube, right? Rectangle. And as we look back at his composition, we start to see that that's kind of what he's doing. He's restructuring. He said that the reason he left the Impressionists is that the color was great. That was all well and good. In fact, when he moved to Paris from Aix in the first place, Pissarro, right, one of the founding Impressionists, he's the one who took him outside and said, "You got to paint outside. Stop painting in the studio. Go outside," right? And actually took him under his wing and walked him out and showed him sort of how good en plein air painting is. And he did it for the rest of his life. But he said the problem with the Impressionists is that there was nothing lasting about it like there is in the stuff you see in museums. Now, these days we think, oh, but that is the stuff you see in museums. But for Cezanne, he saw a difference between Poussin, for example, right, or Rubens. These things had lasting power because they had such structure, and that the Impressionists didn't have that, right? So he's going to try and put some structure back into it, okay? Now, he does Mont Saint-Victoire numerous times in his career, right? And as you can see, I think this is an even better example of what I'm talking about, right? There's this rock quarry outside of Aix, really deep ravines. There's a new movie, there was a movie last year about Cezanne growing up in this area. It was really quite good. But he's looking through this quarry, this red rock quarry, toward the mountain. And it's more or less the same vantage point, a little bit closer, sort of down off to the left. And as we look at the picture and we look at how Cezanne is handling, you'll notice that maybe you won't notice, I'll point out how he's sort of structuring things. Look at the trees on the left at the base of the mountain. You can see that they become this sort of geometric shape of cubes that have been sort of put together, right? If you look at the trees in the upper right, they also sort of do that. And look at the sky between the mountain and those trees and how sort of solid that becomes because of the way he paints it. It's not just one color of blue, but we get these fragments that maybe evoke clouds, but there's those, pen, right? These things right in here, right? That really make it look as if it's got a physical presence on the page. And then we look at the mountain itself, and you can see that a lot of it is actually the bare canvas showing through, right? He's really playing with the paint application to give each section of it vibrancy and life. I'm not quite sure what these are going to bring up. But you'll notice he has these patches of color that work together. And what he's doing is he's bringing sky color down into the mountain, right? Even down into the rock quarry in the lower right corner, because he's not trying to adhere to exactly what the color might have been as he sees it, right? He's seeing his job as to be inspired by nature, but then come back together and put together a composition where every aspect has a proactive role to play. Whether it's the way in which the paint is put on the canvas, or the way in which the colors are laid out, or this sort of structuring of every part of the composition together. Right? There's a close-up of the sky in the upper right, and you can see he's even come back and outlined the mountain a little bit, but how much, on a certain level, doesn't it almost look like that sky comes forward from the mountain, right? As if it's been shaded, as if it's a cylinder, you know? That it takes on, it's not negative space, right? It's not just the background. And he continues to work and he's breaking all the rules because the rules kind of tell you that you should paint the background first and then paint things over the top of it, right? So the foreground sits on top of it. But that's not how Cezanne works. He goes back and forth, and he'll use the breaks in the rocks or tree trunks, the one here in the center, right, of my detail here. And he'll use the branches of the trees as this sort of segmentation of these cubes, right, that end up being things he's interested in. So right here, right, that, for example, becomes a little painting, if you will. And that's sort of typical for Cezanne. So these are things you would never see Monet doing, right? That's why we sort of lump him in the post-impressionist group, even though he starts with them, right? Over in the Phillips, I looked at this for the longest time until I realized what it was, right? So there's Mont Saint-Victoire, right? He's actually doing, and then, right, there's this bit over here. Yeah. Our bushes here are there, right? It's the same composition, but handled entirely differently, and again 5 years later or so. But really open, you can start to see what he's doing. He's patching together these colors, and he's inspired by what's in front of him. But that's not the point. The point is not to replicate Mont Saint Victoire. The point is to use Mont Saint Victoire as the basis for figuring out how to put paint on a canvas in a way where the composition works. And if that means violating representation, okay, right? And by this point, actually he died that year. This is near the very, very end of his career, right? And even as we look at that, and if we start to read the white and pink part here as the mountain, strange color choice for that, then above that, the sky is all of a sudden rock colored, right? Because he's using what he's set up in front of him as the basis for something that exists independent from that at the end of the day, right? That art should have its own existence and not be dependent on what you saw in the first place. Yeah. Now he also does still lifes, and again, it's not that he doesn't know how to paint a tabletop in 3 dimensions with perspective. It's that he doesn't give a rip about it, right? So he's setting up a still life. We've seen still life pictures before. Artists will set up objects with the idea of creating meaning, right? So if we think of older still lives, then when Klaes Hede did this, everything adds to some sort of meaning about life's passage, the fragility of life and death, and the importance of restraint, right? This Baroque idea of getting us to smell and taste and participate. That's not what Cezanne cares about, right? He's putting things on the tabletop so he can begin to make squares and cylinders, right, and cones. And he'll play with it and restructure it because he's more worried about the composition. There's all sorts of things of this. There's just all sorts of wrong, right? That if you were taking an introductory painting class or an introductory drawing class and somebody's teaching you how to draw in 1-point perspective, the teacher come by with the ruler and whap you on the knuckles for it because it's just wrong, yeah? Look at the side of the table on the right. And you'll notice that the top and the bottom, the top of the table and the bottom of the side slat are closer together at the bottom than they are at the back, right? It's anti-perspective. The front edge of the table has a top edge and a bottom, but if you follow the top edge along, you'll notice that it starts to disappear on us, right? He paints over it. He paints it out. It's because it violated what he thought were the proper rules for the perspective. There's a little blotch of red there where the top of the table has the side slat that comes in. All of those wonderful colors under the plate that aren't really explained in any way on the top of the table that Cezanne has included to knit the different colors of the composition together. So he's really sort of actively messing with it, right? Actively violating the rules because it's these compositions within the 4 corners of the frame that the concerns of making that work for him supersede any attempt to have it be correct, right? So he's always sort of shifting things. Sometimes you'll see things from multiple points of view, right? These are different tables, but he's still got that same issue with the corner in the right, where he's mucked the perspective all up, right? Where it gets broader as it goes back into space, whereas we know that's not how the rules of perspective work. Follow the front edge of the table as it goes underneath that cloth and comes out the other side, and you'll see it's not lined up, right? The Rococo vase in the back with that wavy sort of side is round on the front and then flat on the back, right? Just nothing really works together. And if we go to the milk jug and fruit on the left, right, with your eye, trace the outside of that platter, right? Start down at 6 o'clock, come up around noon, and go back down the other side. We're going anti-clockwise around. Just follow it around and see what happens there, right? Between 10 o'clock and 8 o'clock. Is that right? Yeah. I have to look at the clock. 10 o'clock and 8 o'clock, it all of a sudden sort of shifts over, right? He's not lining it up because he thinks the composition he needs something there between those two oranges, right? And then the glass is behind it. And I think I have details of these things, right? So here's a close-up of our... he's seeing these things that he set up as the basis for a dialogue between him and the canvas, right? That is independent from that. That's out there, and you go, okay, look at it, okay, fine. But now I'm going to get in here, and I'm going to start painting this thing. And that back and forth between the artist and the canvas becomes something that's way more important than going back and saying, oh, wait, I got the shadow wrong. Yeah, because it doesn't matter if you got the shadow right. What matters is you got the composition right. And that's what Cezanne is pushing for. And that glass in the background is a nice detail of it. It just is again, it's very strange. It looks as if we see sort of down into the top of the glass, but then it sort of shaves off on the right and disappears. And then if we look at the stem of that wine glass, we sort of see it from the side. So he's playing with these alternative viewpoints, and I think on a certain level, part of me thinks that's almost more realistic in its way, because we don't sit still in life. We move around all the time. And we see things from multiple points of view, right? Looking out here, right? I'll look at Sophia and I'll say, okay, I see this. And I stand over there and I'll look at your water jug from a different perspective. And by seeing it from both sides, right, I understand it better and differently because I've experienced it rather than just simply seen it. Yeah? And Cezanne is sort of, I think, tapping into that on a certain level. So, again, he's picking up ideas that came out of the Impressionists, right? Color being one of them, unblended brushwork being one of them, working outside, working in series. But when he works in series, he's not worried about the changing light, right? He does all of these different still lives of sometimes the same stuff. He loves images of peaches, right? Or he does Mont Saint-Victoire so many different times because each time it gives him a new opportunity to make a composition, to structure the different elements in a new way and come up with a stronger composition. So with Cezanne on the one hand and Seurat on the other hand, we've seen artists sort of playing with sort of structural ideas, right? How to structure the color. Now, the other direction that we'll look at are artists who are interested in expression, right? In sort of an emotional quality within the work. I love Cezanne, but he's not particularly emotional. Seurat, there's nothing there. It's really kind of cold in its way, right? But when we look at Toulouse-Lautrec, and we'll also look at Van Gogh, right? What we'll see are artists who are very much interested in trying to bring expression into their works. Now, like the Impressionists, he has unblended brushstrokes, right? Toulouse-Lautrec painted with turpentine, right? Oil paint thins with turpentine. You may know this from just painting, your desk or something like that, right? The paint thinner. And he loved thinning it down and scrubbing it on that one. He said he felt it gave it a certain spontaneity. But it also makes it kind of grungy looking, which is perfect for the subject matter because he's always doing these images of bars, right? And they're kind of grungy bars as well on the norm. Usually looked down upon by finer society, right? Let's see. Expression. Let's go back to the idea of expressionism. For Toulouse-Lautrec, when he does a lot of people. Vast majority of his images are images of people. Doesn't do landscapes, doesn't do a lot of still lives, but he does do a lot of images of interiors filled with people, and a very particular kind of interior. Modern Parisian interiors of places of recreation, places of a particular kind of recreation, right? And the people that he fills them with have a certain sort of cartoonish quality. They're almost like caricatures. If we look at the faces of the two people in the foreground, the one man that we can see, right? with the hat, it looks like a cartoon, right? You know that's not exactly what he looked like. And as we think about the sort of cartoonish quality, you'll notice that even the clothes have a sort of exaggerated quality. Look at the shoulders of the pea coat worn by the short-haired woman in the middle, right? And the shoulders, how he loves that line, that sort of sinuous line that the shoulders make up, or the green coat in the foreground, right? The clothes themselves have a certain cartoony kind of quality. This is also painted on cardboard. It would often just take old scraps of used boxes, right? And you can even see the seam of the cardboard down below by the woman's hand underneath the table. Yeah, that's a tough one, especially when it's got turpentine soaked into it, right? It just wants to eat apart. That's why you go get a graduate degree in paintings conservation, right? As you learn chemistry and how to stop it from continuing to eat. I took a few classes in conservation, but not enough to tell you how, right? But they can and they have. It's difficult, right? The other thing that's hard is to know the degree to which we see it here 130 years later, right? 125 years later. Whether the reds, for example, in the dress on the left, were initially more vibrant than that, right? And there's every chance they might have been, that it might have grayed through time. Right? Now, do you know anything about Toulouse-Lautrec, his biography, his life? He was tiny. He's 4'11". That's him on the left, right? And he was not a midget, although he often was called one, because he had a full-length torso with tiny little legs, right? So in other words, he was, it would be like if I stood on my knees. And indeed, in the late 50s, there was a biopic made of him, a Hollywood movie made of his life, and the actor who played him just strapped his legs up, put shoes on his knees, and walked around on his knees. So Toulouse-Lautrec had these tiny little legs, and so sort of built almost like a dwarf, but he wasn't a dwarf. What happened is that he had a horrible bone condition, that his bones were very, very weak, and when he was like 12 years old, he broke one of his thighs. And then when he was 13, he broke the other one, and neither of them fused properly and grew back, and it stunted his growth, right? And it's all because his parents were first cousins. And the family, Toulouse is a town in France, Lautrec is another region of France, right? They're landed gentry going back to the Middle Ages, okay? So this is a pedigree family name, right? It's like the Kennedys or something like that, right? This is a name that's got a history. And he is the scion of this family, right? He's the heir apparent to the Toulouse-Lautrec fortune, if you will. He's very, very wealthy, but they're inbred and he's got birth defects, right?
Because I heard of the city of Toulouse, but I didn't hear of him.
Yeah, that's named after his family, right? And so, right, after he broke both of his legs, he began to feel really kind of ostracized from society. And he decides to go live in the suburbs of Paris, in an area called the Montmartre, the Martyrs' Mount, which today is right in the middle of Paris. It's this mountain with the church on top. It's where the Moulin Rouge is in Paris, right? But in the 19th century, it was outside of Paris. You had to actually take like a train, right, outside of Paris. You had to leave Paris to go to Montmartre. It was a little village on this hilltop. And in the village, because it's on a mountain, were windmills, right? And these were converted into cabarets to attract people to come out, right? And they were cabarets at night, but they would function as, because it's a windmill, right? They would function as bakeries during the day, right? And the word moulin is the French word for mill, right? So the Moulin Rouge is the red mill. Right? The Moulin de la Galette is the mill of the cake. Galette is a cake, right? And they were famous for these cakes that they had made. But both of them had also converted part of their premises over to be a bar, right? A dance hall. And I don't know if you saw the movies, right, with Nicole Kidman. Yeah. So, right, you get the sense for that, right? And in fact, the Moulin Rouge opened in 1889, right? So right around the same time. And I bet Toulouse-Lautrec is in there somewhere. I haven't seen it, so I have to go back and see it and see. So there he is, right? He paints his life. And these caricatures and this expressionism that we give it, part of that comes from the idea that he's painting his experience, right? These are autobiographical works. So he's drinking at a bar. This is where he hung out all the time. And he's he's slumming it because he's really wealthy, but everybody else there is sort of marginalized parts of society. So we got prostitutes and pimps, right? We got gangsters, insofar as gangsters are around in the 1890s, but petty criminals, right? And here's Toulouse-Lautrec, the scion of this incredibly important family. In the middle of all this, and part of it is that he really doesn't feel part of society. He feels ostracized, and he goes now to the Moulin Rouge to hang out with other people who have been ostracized, other people who have been alienated from proper society. The French have a word for, it's a great word, a word for this kind of society, this sort of, the soft white underbelly of society, right? They call it the demi-monde. Demi means half, and monde, the half world, right? The demi-monde, which is this world of poorly lit cabarets where kind of anything goes. And Toulouse-Lautrec's father had already died, but his mother was very, very controlling, and she was like really pissed off, right? Because he was going out and he's living it up, right? Spending his money, and he became an alcoholic, right? It would be boisterous, would argue, would laugh it up, right? So the caricature that we see and the expressiveness of the works is indeed, for us, deeply linked to the fact that these are autobiographical. But again, that sort of caricature is not something that you would definitely see the real impressionist doing, right? He's moving in a new direction. He's taking their colors, divorcing them even further from representation, right? All of these greens, for example, right, aren't really the colors he would have seen, although the interiors were kind of greenish and gas lights gave a kind of greenish light. He's really enhancing the colors so that you get the orange hair, for example, of the woman back there, who I think was a pretty famous dancer, right? She was actually known for kicking guys' hats off their heads when she did the can-can, right? And they could see up her skirt, and that made it even better for the guys, right? But I think that's her back there. And, but the colors have been, the Impressionists broke down the door to where colors didn't have to exactly match what you saw. They could, work together, make it seem that way. What Toulouse-Lautrec does is he takes them a step further and makes them more expressive, right? And this is what makes him a post-impressionist. He hung out in brothels all the time. He was always going to whorehouses. And the horse had a nickname for him because apparently the other birth defect is he had an impairment.
Really?
They called him the little teapot, right? Just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. And I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, right? But I've heard for years that a whorehouse in Paris has it preserved. And this is one of these big urban myths, like where is Toulouse-Lautrec's Toulouse-Lautrec, right? But here, again, the same sort of these lurid colors, right? They're extraordinary. Very nondescriptive, but at the same time, they evoke the sense, right? They're expressive of the boudoir of the interior. And Rue des Moulins, this is the street of the mills, goes right by Galette and right by Moulin Rouge. And they're still there, right? You can still go see them. And they were pretty seedy right up until the 50s. And even last time I was in Paris, I was in the Montmartre area. It's still kind of like put your wallet in your front pocket sort of area, so you don't get pickpocketed. But this is the government-sanctioned check for lice day, right? That because prostitution was tolerated, it was then regulated, and so the prostitutes had to make sure they were clean. And here, Toulouse-Lautrec is just drawing the things around him, right? And it has that immediate expressiveness, but at the same time is watering down the paint with turpentine, also gives it that sort of grunginess, that is really part of the world he's trying to depict. Now, the last artist we'll get to today be Van Gogh, right? Van Gogh's Dutch, moves to Paris right around the same time Toulouse-Lautrec is painting these, 1886-ish, 87, he moves to Paris, right? He comes out of Holland. He wants to be a realist painter. He's sort of painting really dark, brownish scenes of coal miners. And he gets to Paris, and the Impressionists are now broken up, right? But they take him in, and Pissarro takes him aside as well and says, get outside, paint outside. You've got to paint in the out of doors. It's the only way to go. Brighten up your palette, otherwise your works sort of suck. And Van Gogh is very deeply religious. There's a new Van Gogh movie coming out with Willem Dafoe.
Is that the one where they kind of do it in his?
No, that was last year where they painted. This is a real live action thing. Willem Dafoe. You know Willem Dafoe, right? He was the Green Goblin in the first Spider-Man, right? He's been around forever, right? They put makeup on him for God knows what reason. He looks like the Green Goblin, even without makeup.
Yeah.
He's been around forever. And Oscar Isaac, who is going to play Gauguin in this. It's coming out like next week, I think. Or maybe it's already out, right? Anyway, it's brand new. Van Gogh's deeply religious, right? And he moves to Paris. He doesn't like it because he doesn't like this, right? He doesn't like this scene. He had originally, his father was a preacher. His first plan was to be a preacher. He was going to use art to help people. That was his idea to begin with, right? And when he gets to Paris, he picks up on Impressionist ideas, and he very much influenced by brightening his palette, leaving the brushstrokes unblended, right? Working with alternative colors that vibrate on the canvas. All of that, but he doesn't like the scene of Paris, so he moves away. He has this idea he wants to paint outside, but he wants to go someplace where it's not raining anymore, right? So he moves to the south of France, which is wonderful. Provence, right? It's beautiful down there. He moves to the town of Arles, A-R-L-E-S, where he spends most of the rest of his career, about 2 years, but man, is he productive, right? He spends about 2 years in Arles. Half of that time he's in a hospital, and there's about 300 pictures, right? Spends the last 18 months of his life back near Paris in the outskirts, and again, he paints at a clip of about 2 a day, right? He's extraordinarily driven, and he's a little psychotic as well, right? That's part of the drive, is that he's a little bit psychotic. So he moves to the south of France, and the idea of moving to the south of France is that he's going to get the sunlight that you don't get in Paris. And he's also going to avoid the temptations of evil places like this, right? And he wants to set up an artist's colony. He wants people to come down there with him, right? We'll work in the countryside together. We'll do what the Impressionists had been doing in Paris, but we'll do it someplace better than that. Nobody wants to go, right? Because Van Gogh's a little nuts. Very early on, he starts to have spasms. We're not quite sure what it was. Epilepsy, maybe. Some recent people have thought that he may have ingested some of his paint that would have poisoned him, right? But the bottom line is, from a very early point in his career, he has a habit of driving other people away, right? He's not easy to get along with. In Arles, people referred to him as the crazy redhead, right? Because he had this amazing red hair, right? And they would avoid his house because he was scream on the streets, right? So again, biography kind of ties into how we talk about his painting. So here in Arles, right, we see him going to the public gardens and painting outside what he sees, this public gathering place. And what makes him so expressive, and I think what makes him so wonderful to this day, is the way in which he applies his paint. This is just extraordinary. Like it reminds me of like ice cream or something, right? Frosting. Because it's so thick and it's so gestural. Does that term mean something? Like you see the vigor of how he applied it. That unlike Monet or Seurat, where they applying colors for other reasons, and Monet will follow a wave, Seurat will give us the points. There's something about the vigor of the movement that makes you understand that he's getting in there and he's digging at this picture, right? And he's seeing the sky as this something that's alive. And he's trying to capture that sense of it being alive, or the orange strokes. And again, orange next to blue, right? That dancing of color opposites, right? That he's using the brushstrokes to capture what he sees to be the forces in nature, right? And this is one of my favorite pictures in the entire city. It's such a great picture. But again, some of it seems almost like it came straight out of the tube, like that white highlight on this blue pine branch that's coming down. Cézanne would never paint this way, right? Cézanne would structure things. This is about individual strokes capturing some sort of essence and movement of nature as he sees it, as these branches move around. Directly behind the man with the newspaper, right? There's this wonderful little flecks of white that are the flowers, and the surface is so tactile, right? So three-dimensional that I think, you could tell a Van Gogh by touching it, right? Because it's so thickly built up, right? And the way the strokes are applied, you still have this extraordinary sense of how he put it down in the first place, right? He doesn't sort of blend that around. Two cool things I'm seeing here I didn't notice was in this picture, but I've seen it in other Van Goghs. Look at the top of the straw hat, that big glom of paint that's sort of right on the crown of his head. Here, here, just there. And then look at this stroke up here. You can see what's happened is the paint's flattened out. Can you see that? Right? He's had a really thick stroke like he has here, but then he laid the canvas in his studio while it skinned over a bit, but it was still wet, and he laid him there. And sometimes when you look at the top of that, you can see the weave of another canvas having pressed into it, because the paint's so thick, and he's working on so many at once that they're just laid up against each other in the studio against the wall, right? It's a nice little detail to see here. Stuff you can't see if you don't go to museums, right? Now, again, we know a lot about his biography, right? And you know this picture. Probably heard of it before, The Starry Night by Van Gogh. It's up in New York at MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York. With this, I think we see the things that we see in the public gardens picture in spades, right? This is it on steroids, where he sees nature as if it were a living force, right? The sky isn't still. Stars don't just sit up there in the great distance and twinkle. They invade our space. They spill into our environment. The Milky Way becomes this extraordinary swirl of light. The hillside in the background it looks like a tsunami. It looks like waters are spilling out, and even the trees in front of it sort of look like waves coming at us. There's nothing still in this picture at all. Everything is extraordinarily vibrant and active. And that's sort of a hallmark of this sort of expressive, gestural style that Van Gogh has. Right? Now, his works fluctuate between a little bit more reserved approach to painting and the things that are more wild. And arguably, Starry Night is more wild than the public gardens at Arles, in that overall sort of fantasy, right? It's a big word, phantasmagoria of things moving, right? Well, we've looked back, and because he wrote to his brother who lived in Paris, who's an art dealer. He wrote to him all the time, and he wrote about the pictures he was painting. So we can usually lock these down to a month. Thank goodness it's not a grad class, right? You'd say, oh, that's April 1889, right? You get to say late 19th century. We now kind of have a pretty solid chronology of when he painted what. And we can match that up with other elements of his biography, for example, his growing psychosis. And what we find is that the pictures that are more exuberant coincide with the periods when he's having the most trouble. Depression, difficulty, seizures, right? And in late 1888, November 1888, he checks himself into an asylum. Right? He's self-admitted into a mental hospital outside of Arles in the town of Saint-Remy. Right? Stays there for over a year, 13 months. He's self-admitted into a mental institution, just to take a break because the world's become too much. Right? This picture is painted from his cell. This is the view from his window in the hospital in Saint-Remy. Right? And it's just an extraordinary picture if we keep in mind what's going on in his life, right? First, it's got that exuberance that we associate with the periods of his greatest difficulty. Richmond's got one of the pictures from the same time period, where he's out walking around the grounds, right? But it's sort of the same hillside that you see here. And again, look at that cloud up above, right? And the wheat fields and how they're moving down below, or those olive trees just beyond that fence, that sort of purple or that grayish blue of the olive trees, right? Or how the mountain itself seems to be, it's like a lava lamp, molten as it moves, right? These are all from this period when he's in the asylum, and things really just aren't going that well. And the vigor with which he lays down the paint has this extraordinarily expressive quality sort of everywhere we look.
Is that the canvas, like those little,
Right
those
in here?
little specks?
Right there?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is. There's a lot of raw canvas to be seen around the edges, for example, right? Our raw canvas. And even though again, this is one of the Google scans, right? The Google Art scan, so you can get it at like 40,000 pixels, right? It's huge. And even in the thicker areas like those two stars that are near the moon, you can find areas of blank canvas, which is wonderful because it's this relief map, right? And you see these layers of paint just built up. But he's not covering every part of it, because if he did, you wouldn't notice that, right? That makes that much more important. Okay, the view from his asylum window, cell window, looking out over this town in the valley, right? Notice how separated Van Gogh is from the town. Notice how far away it is from him. Notice that there's a visual block between where he is and where it is, with that cypress tree, right? Without the cypress tree coming up, that flame-like green tree, the town would actually look closer to us. But as it is, it separates it, and it shows us Van Gogh's isolation, right? From the church, from civilization, from all of those houses with the lights on, where people are up and doing things. And he ain't there, right? This is a profoundly moving picture when you think about it that way. And the idea of including a cypress tree in the picture, whether or not he could see it, right? We don't know if he could see it. But cypress trees in France are always painted or planted at graveyards. Every graveyard in France, you'll see cypress trees. This is not the same graveyard, right? This is in Provence, but it's somewhere else, right? In fact, that's where Camus is buried. My wife wanted pictures of where Camus was buried, the French are. But you can see directly behind her are cypress trees. And Van Gogh wrote about cypress trees. So he knew that they were very powerful metaphors. He said that they reminded him of obelisks in ancient Egypt, like the Washington Monument, right? Because they bridged the earth and the heavens, right? And that's exactly what they're doing here, right? So there's this metaphor of death, right? A metaphor of transcendence from life, which death is, right? But there's also this idea of a sort of pantheistic power of nature within the images, right, that he brings back to it. And there's a close-up of our little town where Van Gogh isn't, right? That same vigor he brings to his self-portraits, right? So here he is looking into a mirror, and every element of it is equally activated, right? Again, when he's more disturbed, things become more expressive. And we know that. We're not just assuming that. We know that by pairing the pictures up with his letters. And he loved doing self-portraits. He did as many as anybody. Part of it is probably because he was Dutch. He knew Rembrandt, right? He would have felt a kinship with Rembrandt, who did so many different self-portraits. This is the tonality that Van Gogh starts painting in, is a Rembrandt sort of tone, before Pissarro says color. Bring some color into your work, right? The technique, I think he's dragging his fingers through it. I think he's painting with his hands, getting back into it and getting dirty with this picture, because those don't look to me like brushstrokes. Those look to me like he's dragged his fingers, right? And he's in there and he's manipulating every part of it. But at the same time, everything is sort of wildly moving and swirling in space, right? Whether it's his hair or his skin. And it becomes this amalgam of these colors, these extraordinary colors that are not at all naturalistic, but are there to heighten the sense of expression, right? This green in the shadowed side of his face that highlights the edge of his nose, that offsets against the orange of his beard. It gives him a sort of sickly tone, right? By this time, you know the story about the ear, right? He cut off his ear at one point. One story says he wanted to give it to a prostitute. Most people think he wanted to give it. He got one artist to come visit him. This was Gauguin, who we'll look at on Monday. Gauguin gets there. He stays for like 5 weeks and finds out that Vincent's like just too off his nut to spend time with, and he leaves right after Christmas time. They've been out like drinking all night and all of this, and they're playing, and Gauguin goes, "Man, you're too much, and I'm out of here," right? And Van Gogh goes back to his house. He cuts off his ear. This is what we think now. And Paul, please stay. Look, right? As if that's going to make you stay. See his ear in his hands. Well, it's the ear you don't see, right? It's the far side. It's his proper right ear is the one he cut off, and he's posed here after losing it in the more attractive side of his face. Right. So now, knowing what we do know about Van Gogh, let's go back to this picture, right? The one we started with. Okay, we had this idea of the Van Gogh's personality, his precarious mental health, his sense of alienation, right? Do we see any of that here?
I guess because he's alone and all the other people are dark, he's like,
So you assume that's him. Is that what you're saying?
I think so.
Okay, so if you read the newspaper reader as being Van Gogh, then yeah, he's isolated, isn't he?
And all the other people don't mean anything because they're dark.
They're dark. His back is to them,
Yeah.
right? He's isolated from them. I hadn't thought about him as Van Gogh. I thought about you're Van Gogh. You're sitting where Van Gogh is, right? I mean, he may have included himself in the picture, okay? And if he did, it's fascinating because he's got no face. We'll see a detail of that. He's got this green blob. It looks like Sandman from old Batman comics or something like that. But right? If that's Van Gogh, then yeah, he's separated. But if you think of that isn't Van Gogh, but Van Gogh is sitting there at the easel painting this, then he's even more separated, isn't he? Mm-hmm. Right? And he also gives us that very strong off horizontal. Right? This is a visual here and there. And the guy's standing sort of at guard almost, right? Blocking it. So whichever of these two Van Gogh is, the viewer or the man in blue, either one of them is alienated from everybody else. Now look at the other people, right? A public park is, a place for meetings, right? Is anybody here engaged with anybody else, right? Look at those pallid faces of the lady and the man. I think it's a woman in the front, a man behind her, right? A man standing in the background, a woman in the blue dress, and then two people sitting over on the left, right? Probably a man and a woman there. But nobody's engaged with anybody else. There's a sense of, each one of them has a sort of sense of they're not part of a community. They just happen to be there at the same time. They're not there together, right? They're there at the same time. So this picture really takes on, I think, more meaning knowing what we know about Van Gogh, because it seems to present, even if the brushstrokes are not as lurid as they are when he's more depressed, that element of the expressive quality is still very much there. My last picture, then we'll quit, is the close-up of his face, right? Because if that's him, then he's a faceless man. And even if it's not him, it's this somebody he's the one person that's facing us, and we don't know who he is, right? It's still terribly anonymous. But what great paint, huh? Right? It's just like almost straight out of the tube. Yeah? Okay, we'll look at Gauguin on whatever the next day we meet, Monday, right? And we'll move on from there to early modern painting. We should be able to get through most of that on Monday and be able to use Thursday next as a review session to sort of talk about the final and what you should expect and how you can do the best possible job. Okay?